So obviously, sexual abuse has been in the news quite a bit recently with all the things going on in Hollywood and other industries, and then the Catholic Church. And now there is, it seems like every other week there's another story. This time it's Asia Argento, the Italian model, an actress who was one of the original Me Too crusaders, and who now stands accused of sexual assault herself after it was revealed that she had sex with a 17-year-old guy. California is one of the very few places in North America where the age of consent is 18. Almost everywhere it's 17 or 16. And this happened in California, so it's a crime. Now, and she should face the legal penalties because a crime is a crime. Now, let me tell you my concern. This is my concern. And I've talked about this before, but I want to go back to it because I think it's such an important concept, and it's an issue that I think we need to work out. This is what I'm worried about. I'm worried that we have turned sexual assault into such a wide, broad category that it's losing its meaning. And in the process, actual cases of rape and assault are trivialized, deprived of significance, because the word is used so often and often to describe things that really don't qualify. I'm very concerned about this because of what it does to the victims of sexual assault and how it interferes with our ability to dialogue about these issues, and also the general confusion that it causes. So I think it's a problem. When we talk about the sexual assault problem, it seems like there are many different types of situations that get kind of lumped into it. It's one of the reasons why I don't like the Me Too. Once you start putting a slogan, once you take an issue, a really serious issue like sexual assault, and you put a slogan on top of it, Me Too, that's the slogan. Well, then it simplifies things way too much, because now you've got this slogan, this category, and then all these different kinds of things end up getting thrown into it, and they don't all belong there. They don't all belong with each other, right? And it seems like in each industry where this has been an epidemic and it's been in the news, what you find really, although they all get lumped into the same category, if we do have to put them in categories, it seems like there are, broadly speaking, really two different categories. So in Hollywood, there are the stories of women being forcibly raped, or threatened if they don't go along with something. And there are the kind of stories you hear about Kevin Spacey, right, where he's going around groping and fondling people against their will. He's forcing himself on 14-year-old kids and so forth. You have situations like with Larry Nassar, where he molested hundreds of kids under the guise of performing medical procedures and that kind of thing. And then obviously you have the Catholic Church and the terrible stories of children being raped by priests. And all of these stories are, provided they're true, of course, they're clear-cut cases of rape and abuse. Nobody disputes that. Okay, that's rape, abuse, assault. And in all of those situations, if there was any justice in America, everybody involved, if they're found guilty, they'd all be going to prison forever. Even though that has only happened very rarely, in these situations. But then you have this other category, which gets thrown in and conflated with all the other ones I just mentioned. So here you have the cases in Hollywood where actresses willingly have sexual relationships with powerful men, sometimes for years. Asia Argento herself, I believe, she was in a sexual relationship ongoing with Harvey Weinstein for like 5 years. She kept going back and engaging in this, in this stuff with him. And they do this for the sake of movie roles and so on. And for more, power and clout in the industry. And then years later, after getting what they want out of it, they claim that they were being assaulted the entire time. And in the Catholic Church, you have some cases where like cases involving Cardinal McCarrick. You hear about Cardinal McCarrick and the controversy surrounding him. Now, there are accusations that he molested children. So, that's in that category. But then a lot of the accusations you hear about McCarrick and also with other, some of these other things as well, these are, in some cases, he's having sex with seminarians. These are grown men who he allegedly lured into bed and then had sex with. But as a grown man, if you let another man lure you into bed and then you willingly, with no resistance, engage in sex acts with him, does that belong in the same category as the 12-year-old kids who are raped by men twice their size? I think clearly it doesn't. And then you also have the accusations against Asia Argento, where a guy at 17, legal age, in almost every state in the union, willingly has sex with this, 100-pound Italian model, making no effort to leave the room or leave the situation. Then he comes back, blackmails her, demands money for it, and gets paid. And now he says he was traumatized by his willing participation in sex acts with a woman when he was a few months away from his 18th birthday. Does that belong in the same category as a woman or a child who gets pinned down and raped by a sex predator? And then you have cases on college campuses where we're told now, drunk sex is rape. That's what we're told now. Because if you're drunk, you can't consent. So drunk sex is automatically rape. So then a woman gets drunk, and this happens all the time on college campuses. I'm sure I'm not scandalizing you by telling you this, but what happens is people go to parties, men and women, and they get drunk, and many of the people there, the reason why they're doing that is because they want to have sex with somebody. And it's part of the reason why they go to these parties. So then you'll have situations where a woman gets drunk, guy gets drunk, they're both drunk, they have sex, they're both eager participants in the moment, and then the next day the woman wakes up and says that she was raped. Does that belong, with these other cases of rape? And then you have instances of inappropriate language or conversations in a work environment where a man is accused of hitting on women or trying to initiate relationships, maybe unsuccessfully, or making rude comments. And all of these also get lumped in and are stuffed under the kind of Me Too umbrella. What you have is a wide variety of cases that, in my view, are wrongly, even dangerously conflated and mixed together and compared. Here's the problem, I think. This is where this comes from. This is where the trouble comes. We have, as a culture, removed all moral boundaries from sex. We have discarded all notions of sexual morality except for consent. That is the one moral rule that we have maintained when it comes to sex. Consent is the only moral rule that we still observe with sex. And so when an immoral sexual encounter occurs, even if it wasn't rape or assault, we have no language with which to describe it. I think there are many cases where where there's some sort of sexual encounter, and we all instinctively recognize that it was immoral, that there's something wrong with it. But because we've gotten rid of the whole idea of sexual morality, we just have no way to describe it. We don't know what to do with it. And so we take the one sexual moral rule that we still have and we apply it to that situation because it's all we've got. Even if it's not appropriate in that case. Because we have no basis for condemning any sexual encounter unless the sexual encounter was non-consensual. So we end up just calling all of these things non-consensual, even if it was consensual, even if both people involved chose to do this thing. In our minds, we have really two categories. There are non-consensual sex, which is bad, and then we have consensual sex, which we think is always good. That's what the culture says. That's what a lot of us have, most of us, it seems like that's the idea that we have. It's like, as long as they're consenting adults who choose to do this thing, then it must be okay. But the reality is that there's a lot of bad sex. There's a lot of immoral sex. There's a lot of disordered, gross, harmful sex that is nonetheless consensual. All of the cases that I mentioned, all the cases I mentioned, they're all immoral, bad, gross, harmful. But they're not all rape. Some of them were, not all of them. And until we acknowledge that there are other ways to have immoral sexual relations with a person, until we reclaim sexual morality and sexual boundaries, we will be stuck trying to condemn all bad sex on the grounds of consent, which expands the idea of consent so broadly as to render it meaningless, so that when we really need it, when there is actual non-consensual sex happening, we don't have any meaningful way to describe it, because the word consent has become is increasingly means nothing, because we've expanded it so much, and we've turned it into this complicated equation where nobody really knows when consent is happening. And even if a person does something willingly and is like, yes, let's do this, but even that might not be consent, because we've turned consent into this super confusing calculus, which it isn't. It's actually very simple. Now, sexual morality is not so simple. That's a much more nuanced thing. Consent is simple. If you choose to do something when you could not do it, you have consented. That is consent. The great hurdle that we face is this modern idea that sex is only immoral if it lacks consent. That is false. Obviously, every situation where sex lacks consent is immoral. That we know. But there are also plenty of situations where sex is immoral even when it has consent. So it is problematic, I think, for someone to willingly have sex in a situation where they could not have sex and then later say they were raped, because that is just not rape. It's not what rape is. It is problematic for a woman to, let's say, have sex with a Hollywood producer because she wants a film role, and then later, after she's gotten what she wanted out of the transaction, say that he assaulted her. It is problematic, and I'm not saying that that's the case in all of the Hollywood Me Too cases. As I already said, there are plenty of, there are plenty of cases where there's actual rape and assault going on. But then there are other cases where it doesn't appear to be that. It's problematic for anyone to willingly do something, making no effort to refuse or to get out of the situation, and then to later claim that they didn't consent, because willing participation is consent. That is the very definition of consent. The only time that it's not consent, the only time when willing participation is not consent, is when there is something that precludes the person from being able to actually willingly consent, or when their consent is coerced. So if there are threats or something involved, then obviously that's not consent. That's not willing participation. You're not willing. It is when you're coerced into doing something, that's not willing participation. Or if we're talking about someone who is at an age where they don't possess the mental capacity to consent, or to understand what sex is and what the ramifications of it are. So obviously that's not consent either. But as long as the willing participation is actually willing, and the person involved possesses the mental capacity to make that sort of willful choice, then it was consensual. Yet, even if it was consensual, it is not absurd for a person to come away from a sexual encounter, a consensual encounter, feeling violated or embarrassed or hurt or used. It is not absurd for them to feel like something wrong happened, like the sex was wrong, and like they were wronged in the process. Because there is indeed a whole vast category of consensual yet wrong sex. And we need to acknowledge that and start talking about that rather than trying to make everything into assault and rape. Now, consensual yet wrong sex, that includes a lot of different things. This is a category where, you have sex that's transactional, sex where it's not respecting of human dignity, where it's done purely so that both partners can exploit the other for pleasure, or where one partner is exploiting the other for pleasure and the other partner, although they're willingly participating, they are looking for something else out of it, or they think that there's love and devotion involved, but there really isn't. Any sex where there's no love, where there's no devotion, where there's no concern for the other person's personhood, okay? All of that is bad, and it's gravely immoral. But if it falls into that category where both partners choose to do it, it's not rape. It's bad, it's wrong, it's even evil, but it's not rape. Rape is a particular thing, and it has to remain a particular thing so that we know what it is and thus can protect against it and can punish it when it happens and can fully understand the severity of this terrible evil, which is one of the most evil things a human being can ever do. I think we have to we have to be willing. As I said, we have to reestablish, I think, some boundaries for sex, some moral rules that go beyond just consent. And we have to get away from this idea that just because it's two consenting adults, it must be okay. That is, for both people to consent, that is just like square one. That's just, yeah, I mean, obviously both people need to consent, clearly. But there's more to it than that. And I think it makes it, when we have turned consent, because we're trying to make consent into something that can cover all cases of immoral sexual relations without ever actually acknowledging explicitly that there can be immoral sexual relations that are consensual. So when we're broadening consent like this, and or the idea of consent, when we're turning it into this very complicated, huge thing, that's where you end up with these ridiculous things on college campuses like affirmative consent rules, where if two people are having sex, they have to continually, throughout the activity, they have to continually verbally say, yes, I want to continue doing this. Yes, I want to continue to. And of course, that's just not human. Human beings, it's not how humans function. That's how robots function. Humans are not robots. And so that's absurd. But that's what we've done when we've turned consent into this thing where, as I said, even, when a person could be in the middle of a sexual activity with another person, and both people could be willing participants, but that doesn't mean, that isn't a safeguard against the possibility that the next day one of the people involved could say, oh, actually, I didn't consent. Yeah, I said yes, I did it, I was into it. I never tried to leave, I never said no, I never even hinted at no, and all that, but actually it was rape. Yeah, it was actually rape. And so it makes into this really complicated thing where it's almost impossible. We've made it where it's almost impossible for a person to actually know if what they're doing is consensual outside of this affirmative consent thing. Unless we're going that far where there is verbal affirmative consent continuously throughout the act and we become like robots. Outside of that, it has become almost impossible to actually know if there's consent. So I think that's where these other moral ideas and rules come into play. Where you could ask yourself, yeah, the other person is a willing participant, but then you could ask yourself, do I love this person? Am I devoted to them? Is this respecting of their dignity? Am I just using them for pleasure? I mean, these are easier questions to answer. These are easy questions to answer for yourself. Once you've gotten past the consensual part of it, yeah, they're willing. Okay, now here are these other questions. And unless we're willing to introduce those ideas to human sexuality again, which obviously over the last several decades, we have ripped all of that away, and look at what's happened as a result. Until we're willing to infuse that back into it, to reintroduce those ideas, I just think there's no hope of any of this getting any better. All right, that's going to do it for me. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks for watching. Godspeed.